I feel like last time we had our podcast, you've maybe done a few speaking engagements.
I spoke at Arbor Moon at the Ann Arbor Cocoa Heads group about Try Swift, which was the conference I went to Labor Day week. And then I also talked about Speculid, which is a Mac app for developers that I've been working on for building graphics for apps. And I just talked about how it works and kind of the guts of the challenges I faced building the app.
Nice. So what is iOS development?
iOS, of course, is the operating system for iPads and iPhones. So typically, it's the process of coding, designing, testing, and packaging an app and delivering it in whatever way a customer would want.
Yeah. So if someone's looking into doing that, what kind of factors go into getting a quote for that kind of service?
So really, it depends on the features and kind of the timeline of the app. So faster timeline is going to mean a higher quote. And then integrating any sort of third-party services. So if you're integrating something like Facebook or integrating any sort of special controls or sensors on the iPhone, like motion controls, then that's going to up your quote. And then the complexity of the data that's being used, especially if it's data that's going to be stored locally or remotely, there's going to be some complexity there, and that will take more time, because that's essentially what we're talking about is quality and time. The more you pay, the more time it will take, and the more higher quality will also mean a higher quote for those services. Yeah. Because that quality also takes time, of course. So offline capabilities, not a lot of apps necessarily need that, but a lot of apps want to have the ability of just having online and offline capabilities, so syncing and things like that. Any sort of UI complexity, any UX complexity, chat, the number of screens is a good indicator of how complex an app is going to be and how much the price is going to be. And then this is much more an issue on Android, but as far as iOS is concerned, it's what operating system versions you support, what devices you support. So is this just an iPad app? Is it just an iPhone app? Is it support iOS 12, iOS 11? How far down the chain are you going? And that usually factors into the price of the quote for developing an app. And also, another thing to mention is, in many cases, we're thinking a green app, but we're talking, starting an app from scratch. That has its challenges, but also picking up an app that's already been developed on has its challenges as well. So that's something that'll weigh into the quote of developing an iOS app. Yeah.
So when you talk about like those factors just now, is there like a common app that you could use it as example of like kind of illustrating some of that stuff? Is maybe like a weather app or something like when you talk about like UI, UX complexity and things like that, like I'm having a hard time envisioning what that means in real life.
Sure. So the way I think about it is a lot of times customers, depending on how much they want to do when it comes to getting requirements for an app, have a pretty good idea of what screens they want. And so I usually get into the process of asking them, okay, what does this app do? What are you trying to do as your end goal? And then figuring out, okay, we'll need a screen for this and a screen for that. And then this screen will go to that. And then I'll start thinking about like different edge cases, because we always have to think like what happens in this case, what happens in that case. And kind of what I do is kind of in a spreadsheet, we'll write out the different screens that an app will need in order for it to essentially work. And then so for instance, we developed a nurse training app, and that uses about 4 different tabs, and probably each of those have different dialogues for adding credits for a nurse. And so we'll have, say, 12 screens in that app, just kind of roughly. And so then I look at the complexity, how much data is being entered. Is it like one field, two fields, three fields? How complex is that data? Is that data dependent on certain variables? Is there a certain range of acceptable values? And then that factors into some of the UX that's involved, or the user experience, because I want to make sure that the user is walked through the app easily and knows what they need to do, and it's intuitive. So I kind of rough guess how many hours that's going to be for each screen. And then we also talk about, like, for instance, with a brand new app, there's some setup time usually involved. And then for each app, there's going to be, or each screen, there's going to be testing involved, say every week or 2 weeks. So that gets added in as well. And then, of course, at the end, there's the issue of getting into the App Store, assuming it's an App Store app, and there's always time involved there, because you'll always find all sorts of issues when you get into the App Store. And there's also dependencies for their marketing or graphic design folks to make sure that they have the assets that are needed to get it into the App Store.
Wow. Do you find that when people approach you about getting a quote or something, do they have a full understanding of the things that you're talking about, or you usually have to really kind of work with people to even explain that?
Usually what I like to do is kind of do a rough tree of how the app is going to work. And then from there, I'll go ahead and make estimates for each of those things. Sometimes I might do something like an initial consultation for a fee, depending on how complex the app is. Yeah. And then what I like to do early on in the project is have basically an app that doesn't work, but at least has the UI and the workflow that they expect out of the app. So that way, early on in the process, they're confirming how the app is going to work eventually at some point.
What are the things, let's say someone wants to do a development project, and they get, let's say, 3 different quotes. What's the reasons, if the prices are kind of varying pretty significantly, what could be different there? What would you be maybe missing out on if you go with the least expensive?
Sometimes they are perhaps using services that might expedite the development process without really offering any ability to customize it later. Or perhaps it's using some sort of different method besides building it native Apple, like Swift or Objective-C. And we can talk about the different methods for developing apps later. But and it's all kind of based on maybe an sense of experience, or just kind of taking shortcuts and things like that. There's some app building templates out there that people might be using as well, which doesn't really fit with what they want. But really, you're getting different quotes based on possibly the quality of work and just what features haven't been completely fleshed out early in the process.
Yeah. So when you say, for instance, that it won't be able to be updated later or something, does that mean they kind of cobble something together and then that's just kind of it and you can't add to it later? Or...
Yeah, that could definitely be the case in many ways.
Do a lot of people, like when they make an app, want to update it later? Or is it kind of 50-50 or, like, well, yeah, we made this and it's good enough and we just kind of let it lie?
I think it's 50-50, but with a lot of, at least with iOS, you need to keep updating your app if you're going to want people to use it. When you come out with a new iPhone that's bigger or has a notch or uses a different... has a different design, then you pretty much have to update your app. You can't get away with keeping it on the App Store because Apple can just drop the app if it doesn't work on newer phones.
Mm-hmm. And so when you're saying people maybe use like a template or something, so is it kind of like a square peg in a round hole thing where it's like, well, we have this starting point and we're going to kind of make it work for you? Or... Yeah,
that's exactly what you could run into. If somebody could just be using like a template and they're not maintaining it and they're not keeping it working, keeping it going. So when the new phones come around, they haven't updated the template or they haven't updated the app. You're going to have to just come back to those people to update the app, and you're kind of dependent on them at that point.
So you're saying you couldn't have somebody else come in and update it then?
Well, somebody else could, but they're going to charge for whatever it takes to reconfigure that app that might be outside of their wheelhouse.
So what is the difference between starting from scratch? Like, to me, I feel like when you start from scratch with something, it's going to take longer and it's going to be more expensive. But then you're saying if you're using a template or, kind of a starting point that somebody else has made, then that can create problems later on too. How do you ever start with a template or anything, or do you always kind of start from scratch?
I've started with some templates before, or at least started with other development projects. And it really depends on that previous team and how well they did. If they did a good job and structured their app well, then it might not be that big of a deal to pick it up. But if it's just cobbled together like what we're talking about, then yeah, there could be some serious issues trying to bring that app in. And if it's old enough that it uses some old code that doesn't work anymore, that could be a serious issue for the new team that comes in and adds new features to the app. And they might come to a conclusion that some of this stuff is worth just burning down and starting from scratch.
If we've been kind of talking about different ways of going about it, does that mean that there are different methods for developing apps for the iPhone?
Yeah, so we kind of talked about some templates. There's app building templates out there, but there's also different methods that deviate from just doing it the Apple way, so to speak. So there's what I like to call like the web development wrapper way of doing it, and the building it in my own favorite language, but still making it native way of doing it. And they each have their advantages. So with the web development wrapper, that's typically something like Cordova or Ionic. Cordova was built by Adobe. And essentially what it is you build a web app, and then you're doing regular HTML and things like that to build the app, and it's wrapped. But you still have access to certain native features on that phone. So to the user, it looks like it looks like just regular app out of the box. But to you, the developer, you're actually just building a web page. There's some questions as far as how to get something like that into the App Store that can sometimes be a challenge. But if you do it right, there's quite a few apps that are built using that technology. When you say native, what do you mean by native? So what I mean by native is, when I say at least looking native, is an app that doesn't look like something that's hacked together using custom components or packaged, like it doesn't use like actual Apple design elements that people typically use when they build an app. So like I've been on certain apps that have like a weird wood grain, or it has buttons that don't look quite right, or has drop down menus, which you don't really see in a lot of Apple apps. And that kind of gives a good indication they use some custom software to build it. Unless, of course, it's designed well and it uses kind of some of the third-party tools we'll talk about in a little bit. So like with a web development wrapper, sometimes it'll just have a weird color scheme attached to it, or it'll have different menus that you don't typically see in an app that's developed natively using Xcode and the tools that Apple has available.
Okay. So it just kind of feels a little off or looks a little off at best?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And then what, at worst, it just doesn't work correctly? Or?
Yeah. Okay. Or it just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't follow the paradigms that people typically are used to when they use a iOS app. Mm-hmm. So go ahead.
Well, if it's clunky and weird like that, why do people even make them or release them?
Because it's cheap and easy. So, I mean, that's kind of it. Also, maybe they're focusing on Android, so they just wanted to make sure it works on Android. And if it works on iOS, that's fine. It's a lot of that. So that is the benefit of a lot of these different methods, is that you can ideally developed for both Android and iPhone at the same time. But in a lot of cases, your UI won't look natural on Android, but also won't look all that natural on iPhone as well.
Okay.
Because you've made compromises.
Yeah. I didn't think it went that both ways, because I've always heard, when I complain about different apps that I use on my Android, usually people are like, well, it's because you have an Android. I just thought, well, okay. I didn't realize it happened to iPhones and stuff too.
Yeah. There's definitely some crappy apps out there on the iPhone.
All right. So what other ways are there to develop apps then besides this cobbled thing?
So we talked about building a website or web page and then packaging it as an app, kind of what Cordova or Ionic does. And then the other method is developing it in a specific language that your development team might know. In a lot of cases, JavaScript, and then building it using that for iPhone or iPad. And you see that a lot with NativeScript, which is built by the folks at Progress. And but even more popular, we see that with React Native, which is built by the folks at Facebook. React is really popular amongst folks in the web development circles. And so if you're somebody who's you already have a web team and they're already familiar with React, then it makes sense. Maybe you just reuse those same people to build an app using React Native. And it uses a lot of the same things that React does, but you can use it to build basically a native app. Whereas the first one takes a series of web pages and HTML files and kind of puts it in a frame or wraps it. This one actually converts the code into native code. So it actually is building a app. There's no HTML or anything like that in the app. It's actually building native features, but it's converting it to native from JavaScript in these cases, or NativeScript.
Okay. Have you done all these different methods?
Well, the one that I've used is Xamarin, which is owned essentially by the folks at Microsoft. So that uses C# to build apps. The problem that I found was you're constantly these tools have to catch up with Apple or Google to make sure that they're compatible. So Apple might come out with new stuff. That means you have to be dependent on them to make sure that they're updating their tools to work with whatever is new when it comes to Apple. So there can be a little bit of a support issue. Also, at least with Xamarin, those files can get pretty large because they might have like a file in there that has to do all the heavy lifting of making sure that the app works, even though it's written in a different language. So your app size might be a little bit large or a little bit slower because of that. That's kind of the issues that I ran into, at least when it came to developing using Xamarin.
So developers use different methods?
Yeah. You'll see a lot of teams, they might just do React Native because that's what they know React. So it's easier for them to just go ahead and stick with that. Or they might be a bunch of web developers. So it might just be quick and easy to use Cordova or Ionic in that case.
So one of the related words or phrases I guess I've heard is continuous integration. So how does this relate to continuous integration?
Well, we're talking earlier about experience, testing, UI complexity are kind of the factors that might make a quote more expensive. And one of the things is being able to continually make sure that as software is written, that it actually is tested. So there's a common term in programming called something like unit testing, for instance, where you'll write a thing that does addition. So you'll write a method or function that does addition, takes two numbers, outputs the sum, right? And then the way a unit test will work is you might have a series of numbers that add up to another number, and you want to continually test to make sure that if you add 2 and 2, that it'll always equal 4 with this function. If you add 4 and 6, it'll always equal 10, and so on. That's just kind of a really simplified sample, but you might have some developers come in and make modifications to this method so that it does things like take negative numbers or take decimal points. So then you need to make sure that you add those tests and you continually are testing both with the new tests, but also the old tests as you make changes to this function that adds two numbers together. So that's kind of the idea of continuous integration, is as your team comes in and makes changes to different functions and methods and features within an app, that the app still works based on the old code that's been written before. And typically how that's done is you might have a machine, a separate individual machine, or you might use some service in the cloud that will take your code, build it, and make sure everything works no matter the environment that it's in, and that it works on whatever you support and whatever devices you intend to support. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, a little bit. I guess I'm having a hard time imagining, like, do some people not test throughout their development?
Yeah, I mean, everybody quote unquote tests, but typically it's, so does it work? Like, and you just kind of use the app and it works and you're fine. But there's so many outliers and different things that people do or might do differently. And there's different kind of testing, of course, but you'd be surprised how many teams don't test and don't do things like continuous integration.
Yeah, it makes me wonder. There's stuff going on at work where they developed a new system and it has never quite functioned right. And then they will do bug fixes. And then the next day, a bunch of other things have been broken. And it's always kind of intrigued me, like, why is this happening?
Yep. And that's a lot of cases. What they find is, the testing is part of the thing that gets cut, because if it works good enough, then it works good enough. And that's unfortunate in a lot of cases.
Yeah. So is this the method you use, the continuous integration?
Yeah. Actually, last night when I was in Ann Arbor, I talked about Speculate and how I used continuous integration. I used a cloud service, Travis CI, which is available for free for open source projects, which is really nice because a lot of services that do continuous integration in the cloud are expensive because of how much it costs. You pretty much have to get a Mac machine in order to do it. So, last night I talked about Travis CI and how there's some customization involved, but also one of the biggest challenges is if you are building, in this case, a Mac app, or especially if you're building an app for the App Store, you have to make sure that you have certificates and keys set up so that, like, for instance, in the case of Travis CI, you might want to just upload it to the App Store as soon as your testing is verified and it works correctly. So that's always something to keep in mind, is to make sure that you have your environment set up correctly and you have things like certificates and provisioning profiles and all the little doodads and security stuff that Apple requires when you want to post something to an App Store. Or in the case that I ran into, just distribute the app downloadable. So there's some other services out there. There's like Mac Stadium, where you're like renting a machine essentially on a monthly basis. And there's Jenkins if you want to run it on site, or Xcode server, which I've been playing around with lately. And the idea is you're not running it on a machine. Like, you'll especially run into the issue where a developer has something specifically set up and it works fine on this developer machine, but then when they run it on somebody else's machine, it doesn't work. Well, you need to know that, because if you're going to write a piece of software, you need to know what's dependent and what needs to be set up, or what you're missing in your application in order to get it to work. It's really nice with iOS because you can just run it in a simulator. But even simulators have some major differences to how it works on an actual device. So you want to have access to something you can reset and start from scratch and run the app and make sure it works.
So is this automated? Is this something you set up and say test every day at 10, or is it something that you do yourself, or how does it work? So
there's a couple of things you could do. You can set it up on a schedule. So you can say, I'll run it hourly or daily. You can especially if you're using something like Git to control code, where code gets checked in. You can listen for changes to the code on like the central server. And when a code change happens, you can get the code and run it on the continuous integration machine. So it's another way to do it. And typically, those are kind of the two main ways: is you run it on any code change that you listen to, or run it on a scheduled basis.
Mm-hmm. So if, kind of your average customer is considering developing an app, are there certain things that they would maybe assume comes along with it, but it doesn't, or just things for them to keep in mind as they start thinking about this?
So we talked about continuous integration testing. That's something that they should look into and ask questions. What kind of testing do you do? What kind of testing environment do you have? Another thing you want to ask is analytics. I don't think people think about that enough, but I think it's super important to have some analytics to know how people are using your app and what issues they have. Is there any sort of bug reporting that's natively built into the app, something like Instabug or Bugsnag or some service like that? Also, animations, like that stuff is pretty complex. Don't make the assumption that there's any animations, any custom fonts, any custom graphics. Those are things that you have to think about when you're building an app. And then any sort of like backup support, any sort of, are you going to actually own the code when it's done? What kind of services are there for maintaining the app? Is that baked into your contract or into your quote? So those are some things to think about when you're asking somebody to build an app for you, essentially.
Okay. Do you offer those different things depending on what your customers want, or do you kind of have a standard, like I always have bug reporting and analytics or something like that?
I always ask the customer what they want because it really depends on their budget. Coming up from my end, I want to make sure that I stay within their budget and make sure that I'm not adding in extra services they might not need. Because in some cases, they just need a simple app. And then, which is what I usually suggest, depending on the budget, is like build something simple, get like not a prototype, but like a usable proof of concept that you can get to your customers so they can actually start using it. And then if you see like there's some issues or there's some features that we really need to flesh out, then, come back to me. Let's build version 2.0 and really flesh this thing out.
So is it easier for people to come in and kind of know how much they have to spend, or is it better to have a range and then work with someone like you to start to home in on like what features they want? Or what's the best way to approach a project like that?
I think both. I think what is the ideal app you're looking at building, and then what's your budget? And that gives a good idea of, because the budget really is going to give me a good idea of what kind of features are reasonable. And also, of course, the timeline, like how soon do you expect it to be done? And that really gives me a good idea because I want to build the best app within what somebody can spend. And knowing those factors really help communicate clearly to me and clearly to them what can be done within that range. I work to make my customers happy, and I want them to be happy. And I hate to be in a position where I overpromise, and that's something I never do. So the other thing to keep in mind is sometimes what the customer isn't really what the customer wants. And so, I could do a really kind of basic estimation, but if they want something more fleshed out, what I like to do is kind of do a requirements analysis and get an idea of what are they really, what's their end goal, and then kind of design around that, and maybe build a report that at the very least, if they don't want that app, then they can take that to somebody else and go, oh, we had an analysis done. This is kind of what we're looking at getting built, and maybe take it to somebody else to have it built for them if that's much more a better fit for them. So it really depends on their budget too. Like, do they want to spend some money on a kind of a report that we can take and then build an app against? Or do we want to put a quick estimate together and build based on that? And so that depends too, is like how much of an analysis do they want beforehand?
Do you have any examples of someone thought maybe they wanted something, but what they really wanted was something else?
Yeah, in a lot of cases, I've found that you hear I have a great idea for an app thing. And I think I'm always surprised at how many times people haven't just looked in the app store to see if that app already exists, because a lot of times it does. And in a lot of cases, it doesn't work very well. So that can always be a challenge. I think in a lot of cases, people don't get into the specifics of the rules that they have in mind. And they don't think of the weird edge cases that actually come up more often than they think. And so they think something is fairly simple, but then they realize that there's going to be situations where, in fact, it isn't that simple, and that there might be a situation where people are running into all sorts of issues because there are certain things that they need. Like, for instance, we had that nurse training app where we have on occasion there are nurses that need certifications in multiple states. So that's a big deal because, the app might have been built to only support one state. And if you're somebody who needs to get certifications in 2 states, you need to track those credits accordingly in both states. And this is something people didn't think about. And we brought that in. And so there are always situations like that. And especially what you get with somebody like me is I've been developing in the Apple space for almost a decade now. And I understand how different UI and UX paradigms work on Apple and what people expect from an app that's on an Apple device. And those are things to think about as well.
You had mentioned earlier, one of the questions was about like who owns the code. Can you explain more what that means? Right.
So you'd always want somebody who develops an app for you to give you a copy or access to the code or repository. I mean, I feel like that's a requirement with any app.
So there are people that don't, like, they develop stuff and then don't give it to the customer?
Yes, exactly. And that is always something to check on. I'm surprised.
What would be the reason?
Maybe in a lot of cases, they don't even think about the code. They just want the app in the app store. And maybe they don't want the customer to see how poorly the code is written. I always provide the code. Like, that just makes common sense.
Yeah.
But you'll find situations where that isn't the case. Okay. So,
yeah, definitely wouldn't have thought about that. So if someone were interested in investigating this, do people offer like a free consultation, or is there usually like a fee to kind of start to explore?
Depends on how much you want me to break down the estimate. If you want something for pretty basic, then I could probably do it for free. But I think it's always better to like talk to the customer, start like sketching things out. And of course, when it gets more detailed, then it's not a free consultation. But for a very basic, I've done free consultations, certainly.
I just mean, like, if I don't even have any idea, like I'm thinking, I want an app. I could probably spend $5,000. I mean, is that even like in the realm of reality? Like, how do you even know what you'd need to put aside for that?
No, I think a $5,000 app would be well below the budget at this point. Yeah, I mean, it's possible to do a $5,000 app, but it's not going to have a lot of features, quite frankly. I think like right now you're talking base price for an app would be $10,000, and it goes up from there. And I think that so typically, that's where you need to start thinking about like third-party services, analytics, complexity, offline UI and UX complexity, and things like that. And that's where the price kind of increases from there.
So other than getting like referrals from people that have worked with folks, is there other ways to kind of tell if who's a good developer and if they know what they're doing?
I think look at their portfolio. I think that's a great way. Look at their references and then kind of get an idea of, talk to them about how a typical timeline will work. And you want somebody that's going to be honest with you and tell you all the different missteps that can go along the way and all the different gotchas that happen in the app development process, especially with like Apple. Like, they'll always something that'll come up is your app gets rejected for the App Store. Now, what are you going to do? And you have to think about those things. And you want a developer that'll be honest with you and forthright about the different issues that could come up. But like I said, portfolio, references, what's on the App Store, what do they have as far as on the company website? What do they have that talks about this kind of stuff that's going to give you some confidence to know that they're actually doing what they're talking about?
So is it safe to assume there are going to be hiccups, there are going to be speed bumps, and it's just kind of a matter of what they are and when they're going to happen?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
So if basically anyone tries to tell you it's just going to be smooth sailing and nothing bad's going to happen, that's a red flag?
Yeah, I would say so. It's definitely a red flag. And like if they haven't given you a portfolio or a list of references, like that's a red flag as well, because they probably don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah. So what kind of things, besides getting a budget, are there certain things that a customer should think about beforehand or prepare in order to make the most of that time?
Have regular meetings with that customer, talk to them, make sure you have a copy of the app to test around on your own machine, on your own iPhone, so that you can look at it, get it into your hands as quickly as possible so you can see it and talk about it and look at what issues come up. And I think that's a big part of it.
I feel like what we've talked about does make it maybe seem less scary to me, if this was something I was going to be investigating for myself, which I think is a big thing, right? I mean, a lot of technology stuff, I feel like it becomes kind of based on fear. You either make decisions based on fear or you don't make decisions based on fear. So, I think anything that makes it a little more easier to understand is good. Right?
Going to our discussion previously about continuous integration, I think it'll be interesting to see how Mac Minis fit into other development shops and how they might employ Mac Minis in their environment, because that I think is the biggest draw of getting a Mac Mini is having a continuous integration machine you could format and do all sorts of stuff with and break essentially without having to worry about the cost of getting a ginormous machine to do it, because it just needs to run every so often and test your work.
Yeah. Well, cool. This has been super interesting. I always learn a lot from our discussions.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Theresa.
Yeah, great. I can't wait till next time.
Yep. Talk to you later.
Bye.